We have long been led to believe that Iran is the biggest threat in the Middle East, and there's some truth to that. But with the world distracted, another bigger, more sophisticated, and dangerous enemy is secretly building a cage around Israel. This country is actively bamboozling the West into believing it's one of them, but actually is spearheading the movement to Islamize the world and to become the caliphate. How have we allowed for this to happen? And is it as bad as I'm making it sound? Hold on, guys, because this story is a doozy and it's going to impact all of us. This is the Meira K Show on JNS TV. Let's dive right in. So it's December 1818 in Istanbul, and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful man in the Muslim world, is watching an execution. The man in the cage is Abdullah bin Saud, the leader of a rebel movement from the desert of Arabia. He and his family have done the unthinkable. They have challenged the Sultan's right to lead. At this time, the Ottoman Empire was a massive, multi-continental superpower that had dominated the world for 600 years, led by a caliph, the supreme leader of all Muslims. Israel was eventually also captured by this empire, and in the deserts of Arabia, Abdullah bin Saud, the head of a rising tribe from the desert, had had enough. Unhappy with the Sultan, he was making a direct play for the crown of Islam. To do so, he captures the holy cities of Mecca and Medina because Jerusalem was not yet holy to them, and to prove to the Turks that they were no longer fit to lead the faith. After all, if Allah had allowed someone else to take over the holiest sites in Islam, he can't really be on the side of the Caliph, can he? In response, the Sultan of Turkey, i.e., the Ottoman Empire, didn't just fight back. He unleashed a total war of annihilation, crushing the Saudi revolt, razing their capital to the ground, and bringing Abdullah to Istanbul to be executed in a public display of absolute Ottoman dominance. But as the Sultan watched the blade fall, he couldn't have known that 100 years later his own empire would collapse and that the descendants of the man in that cage would return. By the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire is now a shell of its former self. It was bankrupt, technologically decades behind the West, and so unstable that the rest of the world called it the sick man of Europe. Notice how they're referring to Turkey as European and not Middle Eastern. The end of the Ottomans comes after World War I, when they'd made a desperate final gamble by siding with Germany, hoping a victory would save their empire. Instead, they were crushed. As the empire fell apart, the British and the French swooped in like vultures, carving up the Middle East into new borders, creating the modern countries of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. Of course, the Middle East controls the oil, and the West was desperate to control those elements. Amidst this chaos, a Turkish war hero named Mustafa Ataturk realized the old system was dead. He didn't just want to change the government, he wanted to kill the whole identity of an Islamic empire completely. He believes that the Islamic Empire is not the way of the future, and in a move that shocked the world, he abolished the caliphate and stripped away the religious laws that had governed the empire for 600 years. He told the Turkish people that the Islamic Empire was a burden that had kept them poor and backwards. His new plan was calculated. Turkey would stop trying to lead the Muslim world and instead try to become a modern, secular European nation. Some believed him, but many did not. For nearly a century, his plan actually kind of worked. Turkey builds a massive military, joins NATO, which is the military alliance of the European countries, and becomes the bridge between the East and the West. They wear the suits, they follow the rules, and for nearly 80 years, Turkey's government is run by the White Turks, the westernized, secular military and political elite. They ban headscarves in universities and keep religion strictly out of public life. But as we have already come to discover, the modernized groups in the Middle East are not often representative of the entire population, and a growing conservative and Islamic group is rapidly becoming angered at the modernization of their country. And modernization was enforced. In 1997, the mayor of Istanbul, a man by the name of Erdogan, was actually imprisoned for 10 months just because he recited a religious poem in public. Obviously, that's a little bit simplified, but it kind of explains what was going on, and this made him a hero to the religious masses who felt oppressed by the secular government. To add to this, the economy is also crashing due to the corruption, which we oftentimes also see with these new modernized leaderships, and it's time for new blood. Like what you see, the 2026 JNS International Policy Summit is happening April 15th to 17th at the Waldorf Astoria in Jerusalem, and I will be there. I obviously would love to see you there as well. Head to the jnssummit.org to register and check out this year's incredible speaker lineup. I hope to meet you in April. In 2002, the explosion finally happens. Erdogan's party sweeps into power, promising to give a voice to the forgotten religious Black Turks and to fix the broken economy. He begins a 20-year masterclass in how you dismantle a democracy from the inside out. He uses his early popularity to rewrite the constitution, turning the presidency from a ceremonial role into a position of absolute power, effectively making him a dictator in all but name. For his first decade, he plays a genius double game. He acts like a liberal who wants to join Europe, using Western-style reforms as a shield to strip the secular military of its power, effectively dismantling the only group internally that could actually stop him from staying in power and keeping the secular Turks somewhat happy with him. Turkey is now completely entrenched as well as an ally of the West. They are part of NATO with the second biggest army, making them indispensable. Once the military was sidelined and the economy was booming, the mask begins to slip. Erdogan realizes that no matter how many suits they wear, Europe is never going to let 85 million Muslims into their club. They never become a member of the EU, and he decides that if Turkey can't be the junior partner of the West, it would become the master of the East. To do so, however, he needs a new language. He replaces his old, cold, secular speeches of the past with this new fiery rhetoric of victimhood and religious pride, telling his people that the West wasn't just a partner, but a crusader force that had been trying to keep Turkey weak for a century. This rhetoric isn't just for show, it's an audition of his for the leadership of the entire Muslim world. He's pinpointing the problems that the Muslim world has, and he's setting himself up as the person who can save them. Up until this point, Iran was leading the game as the defenders of Islam by targeting Israel. But for Erdogan, he is vying for that crown. In the fight for the return of the caliphate, the ideal supreme Muslim leadership, he knows Iran's strategy is to gain legitimacy by waging a proxy war against the Jews, namely Israel. Turkey once had a strong alliance with Israel, built on billions in trade and tourism, but Erdogan realizes that Iran's stronghold is messy and violent, and as the war in Gaza begins, he sees his opening to become the civilized but uncompromising defender of the Palestinians. By 2026, Erdogan has taken the most extreme anti-Israel position in Turkish history. By calling Israel a terrorist state, he is placing himself as the new caliph. Some people even say that he calls Israel out up to 10 times a day. He is positioning himself as the only leader with the guts to say what the kings in the desert only dare to whisper. And in classic Islamic dictator style, he has purged his own country to ensure no one can stop him. Iran wanted to destroy the Middle East, and Turkey have decided that they're just going to own it. But Erdogan isn't just a man of rhetoric. He has a very extreme plan in place to do just this. But we'll get to that in a second. Because remember the Saudis? You know, the descendants of our man from the beginning of the story, the one executed in a cage in Istanbul? Well, in our previous episodes, we reported on how they were turning on Israel, shifting their strategies in real time. They didn't forget what the Turks had done to them, especially once Erdogan started playing games. The Saudis wanted nothing to do with them. You see, for the last 100 years, they haven't just been building a country, they've been trying to build an economic superpower. First, they did it with oil, making themselves the central bank of the global energy market, and to do so, they decided to become allies with the West. They wanted nothing to do with the countries playing the Islamization game. But all the while, maybe they were actually playing a double game, vying for the Islamic crown as well. To the world, they claim that they want an Islam that is more palatable, that is rich, that is an equal contender with the West. And so they make friends and allies by being so rich that they're undeniable. Under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the kingdom has realized that oil is a finite power and they must stay on top. So to do so, they're spending trillions to turn the desert into a tourist hub like nobody can imagine. They're not just building hotels, they're really kind of building out the future. And people are noticing, many people. But here's the part that a lot of us have missed. While the media was obsessed with the idea of Saudi Arabia and Israel becoming best friends because they're both so futuristic, the Saudis were never actually interested in that. They didn't want a peace deal with Israel because they like Israel. They wanted it to find favor with the Americans and to get the security guarantees that the US provided them against their enemies in the Middle East. But as we hit 2026, the math has suddenly changed. The Saudis are watching Turkey's rise and they're watching Iran's weakness, and they're understanding that they no longer need to beg for a deal in Jerusalem in return for security, as America's perspective on how to deal with the Middle East is shifting dramatically. In fact, their power and status, combined with the likes of Qatar, have even managed to make Trump pause in his tracks, stopping the Iran attack, which could have impacted the Saudi economy. Of course, we don't know that the attack has stopped completely, far from that. But the Saudis realize that with the right alliances in the Middle East, there might be more effective for them in the long term than just banking on America. They haven't forgotten when the US didn't stand up for them just a few years ago, and in the last few months, the Saudis' tone has shifted dramatically. Their state aligned media, which once whispered about the benefits of regional integration, is now publicly scathing critiques of Israel. It's even worse at this point than Al Jazeera. They are moving the goalposts, demanding an irreversible Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, a demand they know that the current Israeli government will never meet, which signals their lack of intent to take this seriously. But most importantly, they are making allies with the direct enemies of Israel in the West, even if the West won't admit that they're enemies just yet. They have turned on the UAE and they have started buddying up with Qatar, but now they are also buddying up with Turkey. Why beat him if you can join him? Just a few days ago, on February 3rd, the circle was semi-completed. The descendants of the man beheaded by the Ottomans sat down with a modern sultan in Riyadh. They signed a deal to merge their visions, Turkey's military industry and Saudi's bottomless bank accounts. The Saudis aren't just shifting strategies, they're now realizing that if they joined forces with Turkey, they don't need to choose between the West and the East. They could be the center of the world themselves. Not to mention that they are now quietly building out a partnership potentially with Pakistan, the only Muslim nation with nuclear weapons. To be clear, this, if this happens, is the beginning of an Islamic NATO. With money from the Saudis, industrial tech from the Turks, and nuclear deterrence from the Pakistanis, this is a challenge that the West is not prepared for. The Saudis and the Turks have seen that the US is slowly backing away from the Middle East, and they've realized that there is a power vacuum. When that happens, the vultures arrive. But as I told you before, the story gets a lot worse, because this three-way agreement isn't the only problem. Whilst the world has been distracted by diplomacy and peace deals and everything else going on in the Middle East, Turkey has been secretly, busily building a physical cage around Israel. Have you noticed their military interventions in Syria? Turkey now maintains a significant military presence in northern Syria, where it controls territory and supports armed groups. This gives Turkey leverage close to Israel's northern borders and influence over developments in Syria, a country that borders Israel directly to the northeast. How convenient! Because in addition to this, Turkey's foreign interventions form a clear regional arc that increasingly tightens around Israel. From northern Syria, where Turkey controls the territory, to northern Iraq, where it now maintains bases and conducts regular strikes, through Cyprus, where tens of thousands of Turkish troops have remained since 1974, giving Ankara a permanent eastern Mediterranean foothold, down to Libya, where Turkey's military intervention secured influence over Mediterranean energy routes, across the Red Sea and Horn of Africa, via its largest overseas bases in Somalia and into the Gulf, with a permanent base in Qatar, all the while backing Azerbaijan military to expand Turkish-aligned power in the Caucasus. This is without even talking about their intervention in East Jerusalem and in Gaza, where we know they're trying very, very hard to have a say. All of these deployments together reflect a deliberate neo-Ottoman strategy to project power alongst Israel's northern, western, and southern strategic corridors, limit Israeli maneuvering space, and position Turkey as the dominant power shaping the region's military and political balances. By the way, in January, Turkey took its most aggressive military steps yet by deploying F-16 fighter jets and elite ground troops to its base in Somalia. This is about positioning NATO-grade hardware at the mouth of the Red Sea, the single most important trade artery for the Israeli economy. It's no coincidence that this comes at a singular time to Israel recognizing Somaliland, as both sides realize that this place is going to be important for them strategically. It can't be underestimated. Silently, they have been creeping up on different locations that surround Israel, they being Turkey, whilst Iran created a ring of fire, the idea that we're familiar with, from Hezbollah to Hamas. Turkey has been doing something a little bit similar. When you look at the map today, this new steel curtain is almost complete. It's a different strategy to Iran. It's about stopping Israel's strategic trade abilities and hitting them where it hurts, the money, because in the Middle East, that's often what it boils down to. But take note, this is them starting a war without really starting a war. Turkey's allowed to have a base in Qatar and in Syria. What's that problematic? It's not a terrorist entity like Hezbollah was. They're just silently there. But when the time comes, they could turn up the heat and use their very strong military powers to our disadvantage. When I first spoke about the Saudis turning on Israel, I was doubted. But this new alliance between Saudi and Turkey, when Turkey is actively working so hard to become an enemy of Israel, kind of proves it beyond any doubt. Why would they be buddying up with the biggest future threat to Israel? At the same time as they are moving away from the UAE, the country that is so aligned with anti-Islamization, because they, both Turkey and Saudi Arabia, have realized that the time for an Islamic empire is now. With everything happening in Europe and the changes of the wind in the Middle East and the West backing away, if they can get over their differences, they become unstoppable working together. It has long been my belief that the concept of this new moderate Islam is a sham, and whilst I may be wrong about some countries, both Turkey and Saudi Arabia are proving this theory true, that friendships with them are fickle and are in their interest. When the time is right, when they smell a power vacuum, the ideals that they are standing behind fade, and that's what's happened here. Two countries pretending to be aligned with Western values turn back to Islam in the blink of an eye. But these two countries are so much more dangerous than Iran because they are legitimized by the West. They're not sanctioned, they're welcomed, and they are part of the alliances here. Pretty soon, the world is going to have to understand that they have been duped. In Islam, they believe that once they own a piece of land, it is their moral obligation to keep it in Islam's hand, seeing as once you're conquered, you are conquered forever. And it seems that Turkey has not forgotten the conquering of the Middle East, the world, and specifically Israel. The Ottoman Empire collapsing was a religious catastrophe, and for years Turkey ignored its sacred duty to focus on Europe. But now, vying for the Islamic crown, the takeover of Israel is non-negotiable. And whilst this isn't clear to the world, it's clear, I hope at least to us. Will Israel end up leading the charge against these accepted nations? Time will tell. That will depend on what we truly learn over the last few years. I'm Ira Kay, and I will see you next time. Hi guys, I'm Ira, and I made a mistake in the previous episodes. Facts are unbelievably important to us, and I take full responsibility for that. We spoke about how the Shah was kind of put there by the Americans, and that isn't true. That's actually the narrative that the Islamic regime is trying to make us believe, and unfortunately I fell for it. I just wanted to clarify that with you because, as you know, we take our reporting here very, very seriously. So my apologies, and if we ever make a mistake again, make sure to hit us in the comments and you will definitely see us retract it.